It's Friday, and we are working for Crusoe, Friday, September 8th. Sam Park and John Ramey with you, discussing economics and international affairs. The first Africa Climate Summit gives birth to a declaration calling for new taxes and reforms to combat climate change. The climate crisis has impacted Africa more than anywhere else. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, convenes in Jakarta. High-ranking American, Chinese, and Russian officials lurking. China bans the iPhone in government offices, and Apple's stock price drops 6%. We'll start with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Sam Park, a 3-day summit. You always like to track the length, I guess more of like diplomatic visits, but a 3-day summit, that's a healthy length, right?
Yes. In fact, and this actually clarifies some questions that I had. It was convened in Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, and the president of Indonesia, Joko Widodo, who, like the president of Brazil, Luiz Inácio da Silva, has a cool nickname. President da Silva is known universally as Lula, as we know, and President Joko Widodo of Indonesia is known colloquially as Jokowi.
Jokowi.
And so, yes.
It's a portmanteau of his name.
Exactly.
Got it.
And so he convened the summit, and it turns out, he said yesterday towards the end of the summit that it's actually a sort of a summit palooza, that in fact he had convened 12 different summits over the course of 3 days, an average of 4 summits per day. And so,
I can do that math.
Yeah, I'm glad. And that seems like a lot of summits.
So the focus of these summits, the bloody civil strife in Myanmar, which has been going on for years.
Yes.
And South China Sea territorial disputes, right, which we keep an eye on and hear a lot about. And of course,
ongoing and escalating, actually, a little bit.
And okay, so ASEAN, it's 10 member states, right? Don't you think we should identify them? It's Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And what do all those countries have in common? They've got China lurking over their shoulder. So, of course, they want to talk about the South China Sea.
Yes.
And, of course, Kamala Harris was there. And, of course, Li Qiang, the premier of China, was there.
Yes, equal status, you'll note.
Number twos from both U.S. and China.
Exactly.
And with Sergei Lavrov, is he number 2 in Russia?
No, he's the foreign minister, actually.
Okay, but still like on the first string.
Yeah, I mean, honestly.
He was there too.
I don't think Vladimir Putin has an official number 2.
Right, I mean, that makes sense.
Yes, exactly, right, because,
number 2s get ambitious, and that means something different in Russia.
Exactly, right? So, I mean, effectively, Sergei Lavrov might actually be that guy, right? Because he's been there, as far as I can tell, from the beginning. He's OG.
Maybe not on paper, but effectively.
Yeah, he's OG in the Putin regime, no question about it.
So you've got these 3 high-ranking global power officials just kind of hovering around this 4 summits a day for 3 days. It's an interesting dynamic.
It is. And I think that we could discuss later that it seems to share certain things in common with the Africa Climate Summit that took place at the same time in Nairobi, Kenya. But it seemed as though Vice President Harris, for instance, and Chinese Premier Li Qiang almost seemed to go out of their way to not be there together. I kind of feel like this might have been at the behest of Jokowi. Now, this is, mind you, sheer speculation, just of the most idle kind, based on no reporting whatsoever. But
that's
John,
just your instinct.
Yes, as we both know, John, idle speculation is the most fun kind of speculation. Right. But it really did seem to be presented that way. For instance, there was at the G20 summit last year, which was also in Indonesia, Jokowi said, "Stop the war." But obviously that didn't happen. And So I kind of feel like in the case of both these summits, the convening nations said, look, it's sort of like the bartender, right? If you guys are going to fight, take it outside, right? We don't want to be the staging ground for whatever issues you have between yourselves. We have our own issues that we want to discuss in our summit, right? And this is our summit. It's not your summit, right? China is not a Southeast Asian nation. They're there as a guest, right? So is the United States. So the guests need to behave themselves. And I kind of feel like this had something to do with the way this was all presented to us over the course of 3 days.
Well, it makes a lot of sense because the big topics were, as we mentioned, the civil war in Myanmar, and then the U.S.-China rivalry, which is it's not exactly the South China Sea territorial dispute, but it's not that, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And
right.
and Li Qiang, the Chinese premier, the number 2, said during this summit it was important to avoid a new Cold War. And then Jokowi said, if people can't manage their differences, we, meaning the ASEAN group, the 10 Southeast Asian nations, will be destroyed if they get caught up in the what he called the currents of rivalry.
Yes, that's right.
And I thought it was a pretty poetic way to explain to the 10 nations there and the world that's listening that, look, you don't want to get divvied up in a new Cold War between China and the United States. That's not going to be in the long-term interest of any of the smaller nations.
And that, I think, returns to a theme we've discussed numerous times already, which is the differences between the actual Cold War and what seems to be a Cold War footing today, right? Which is that developing nations have a much louder and more important voice that they're not shy about using in this conflict as opposed to the last one. And in fact, they see, and to their credit, I would say, they seem to be very eager to distance themselves from any sort of kind of bipolar conflict between the United States and China, with Russia as China's henchman. And I think
they're wise because they can pitch themselves accurately as, hey, we're a growth market if you play this right.
That's right. And I think, especially in the case of Indonesia, I remember a couple of weeks ago when we were discussing the expansion of the BRICS group. And it feels like Indonesia was sort of left out of that, right? They were not among the candidate nations to join the expanded grouping. And many people thought that they ought to have been, or anticipated that they would be if there were such an expansion, but they were not. And again, in more idle speculation, you and I, that is, thought that perhaps it was at the behest of Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, who we speculated did not want to expand to begin with, but if expansion needed to happen, his price was that Indonesia not be included, because Indonesia is 200 million people. It's an Asian powerful nation. It's, by the way, a majority Muslim nation, and in fact, the largest majority Muslim population of all the nations on Earth. So Indonesia has good reason to feel as though they might, I wouldn't say be antagonistic towards China, but to feel that they're just kind of being used as a chess piece. And nobody likes that, and no one's going to sit still for it, and they ought not sit still for it either.
Any other big things you want to talk about regarding the ASEAN summit?
The other thing about ASEAN, I would say, is that they don't ever actually do much of anything because they have a unanimity clause in their charter, where in order to...
Like, it's hard enough. I mean, without a unanimity clause, exactly. any block is like, geez, wow.
Yeah. And so that, that's just kind of,
that's rough.
Yeah. Whatever kind of statements they issue are generally of the most anodyne kind. Right. But that's why the rather, seemingly forceful statement of Jokowi is actually significant, right? Is that he was able to get everybody to sign on to this, and good for him. He's been Indonesia's president for a while now. I think he might be term limited, so I don't think he's going to be there much longer. So he doesn't have a whole lot to give up, right? And good for him. Indonesia has been a rising power for quite some time now, and they actually ought to play a larger role on the world stage than they traditionally have done. And I think they will as time goes on.
To the first Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi, Kenya, which took place earlier this week. And from this, the Nairobi Declaration, which is a proposal for new global taxes and reforms to international financial institutions to help fund climate change action in Africa. Now, the president of Kenya, William Ruto, had some illuminating facts about Africa and climate change, right? Africa contributes like 4% of global carbon emissions annually, right?
Yes, but despite having about 20% of global population.
Right. But they are absolutely receiving the brunt of man-made climate change. Like there's a drought in the Horn of Africa. Half the people are hungry in Somalia. That is essentially, it's not even like disputed anymore in the scientific consensus. This is a human-caused drought, right? In 2019, there was a surprise cyclone in Mozambique that killed 1,000 people. In Democratic Republic of Congo this year, 400 people have been killed in floods. Extreme weather is hitting Africa worse than anywhere else. And they're also getting, the faster they run, the behinder they get. They're getting more and more in debt because of the financial impact of these catastrophic weather events. I know in the DW report you sent me, in Europe, they have like 350 approximately weather radar tracking stations. In Africa, which is larger than Europe and has more intense weather, there are 37.
Yes.
Right.
Just from almost a factor of 10.
Right. Just basic forecasting. Like, hey, is there going to be a surprise cyclone in Mozambique that kills 1,000 people? That's more likely to happen now because of the climate crisis. Yeah. Nobody knows.
Yeah. It's absurd. It's literally absurd.
I just and the other thing, I'm sorry to continue my soliloquy, but Ruto, the president of Kenya, says Africa has 60% of the world's renewable energy potential and nearly a third of the minerals crucial to electrifying industries that are currently dependent on fossil fuels, right? So you've got this fascinating collection of ingredients. You've got 600 million people who don't have electricity. You've got a ton of the materials that are needed to convert polluting industries, and including energy, into green energy, right? Like there is actually quite a lot of the solution exists in Africa.
Yeah, the math would seem rather simple, right? The problem is the numbers are very large.
Yeah.
Right. You'd have to move a lot of resources to put this together. But William Ruto, the president of Kenya, by the way, a very experienced and savvy politician who spent years in the political opposition before finally becoming president of Kenya. But that's a different story. Kenya produces 93% of its electricity from renewable sources.
They're nearly Iceland.
Yes, 93%.
I don't know if people walking around in Los Angeles or Reno, Nevada, where I am, know that, right? Like you might think Iceland can do it or some small.
I didn't know it until last week.
93% is renewable.
It's remarkable.
It's incredible.
Just to back up into what you were just talking about, we've mentioned on this podcast many of the coups in the Sahel region. I don't want to say they were caused by climate change.
They were exacerbated by it.
Yeah, but let's just say that climate change in the Sahel doesn't make these societies any more stable. I think that we can rather safely say. And so, but what the Sahel has lots of? Sun and wind, right? And so, again, Just put up the wind farm, just put up the solar farm, but somebody's got to pay for it. Right?
I'll tell you, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Sam. I'll tell you what's more lucrative than being a jihadist.
Right.
Being a wind turbine tech.
That's right. And so somebody's got to pay for this stuff, and it shouldn't have to be the African nations themselves, because this is a problem that has been foisted onto them by the more developed nations of the world. That is us and our allies. This summit, again, sort of resembled the ASEAN summit in that Western and Russian and Chinese guests who were there did not get prominent speaking roles. I didn't even think John Kerry had been there at all, right? It turned out that he was there on Monday, which is not a good slot, right? As you and I know from our many musical gigs, right? This, really, Monday? And just like, I'm John Kerry, man, but I think that's to the good, right? In the final summit photo, it was all African people on stage, right? And I believe, much in the same way that we would speculate about Jokowi programming the ASEAN summit, I believe that William Ruto did something similar and said, look, this is our summit. Not only that, it's the first ever Africa Climate Summit. They're going to have them every 2 years, they say. And so for the first one, I don't want to hear from any of you people, right? This is our statement that we're going to make about climate change and how it's impacting us and what we want for it. I think, had they been more experienced in hosting summits of this kind, and by the way, I have some experience putting on much smaller conferences than
right.
This
You've
one.
been actually a booker, a conference speaker,
yeah,
booker.
And it's it's a long and just, I wouldn't say arduous, but it's just a kind of painstaking process. Yeah, it takes a while. I think if they had it to do over again, they might not have done it the same week as the ASEAN summit. That just seems like kind of, a rookie mistake, frankly, right? But at the same time, as we'll talk about next week, the G20 is starting right now, right? And so you really do want to get this done before the G20, and, you maybe couldn't do it anyway. It's hard to schedule these things. I don't want to be too hard on William Ruto.
Couple other notes from the first Africa Climate Summit. One estimate says by 2050, Africa will be losing 50 billion US dollars, that's billion with a B, every year to climate change and climate change related impact and disaster recovery, right? That's a staggering annual number, 50 billion a year by 2050. And compounding that is something that we've been hearing about. Remember at the turn of the millennium, there was the debt relief drive, right? And
yes.
Borrowing costs in Africa are 4 times that of the U.S. and 8 times that of rich European nations, right? So we hear the phrase "it's rigged" a lot, unfortunately, in American politics. The deck really is stacked against Africa financially, and that is why they had this summit to kind of explain to foreign people, like, show us the money, we can help. And also, I should have mentioned this earlier, the point of the summit also was to get a unified African negotiating message for the UN climate summit, which is coming up in November, which is counterintuitively called COP28 because it's not 2028. And at first I was like, wait, is it like the Olympics? Is it coming up in 28? It's the UN climate summit. They need to lose that COP28 number.
Yeah, I agree.
They just started counting 28 years ago.
Yes, I think it's not an especially well-named summit.
But it's good that they're going to have a unified negotiating agenda for this.
Yes, I agree with you entirely. And there has been some halting and preliminary progress on debt relief, which I think should just be wiped out, frankly, right? I mean, or just like, okay, we can apply the debt to something else or something like that. There must be some kind of mechanism. But there are there is progress being made between basically China and the IMF and latterly the World Bank.
Right, because China holds a lot of that debt. It's not all Western countries.
Yes, and it's one thing for the IMF to be able to, sort of forgive a certain amount of debt, but if China's not going to, then it kind of gums up the works. But there has been some progress, mainly in regard to Pakistan this year. So hopefully that can be broadened out to apply to some of the African countries also. And much as with the ASEAN summit, African nations, I think, have every right to feel as though they were also sort of frozen out in the BRICS expansion, right? Ethiopia was one of the only, Egypt is an African nation, but we tend to think of them as more of an Arab nation. And right. By the way, they tend to think of themselves that way also. But I mean, if you look at the 6 nations that joined, right, fully four of them were what we would more call Middle Eastern nations. That is Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Egypt, right? One of them is South American. And so that really leaves Ethiopia as the only sort of full-on, African-only nations. But they're also, by the way, very close to the Middle East also, right? There are plenty of African candidate nations that could have been in the BRICS. Namibia, Botswana, I could go on. But the point is that if the BRICS is supposedly taking a stand for what they call the global South, maybe not have 4 Middle Eastern nations that are, 2 of whom are actually quite wealthy, right? Is that really how you want to do this here? So there's an opportunity here, right? This sort of BRIC expansion doesn't really seem to be, we were talking about it when it happened, but I guess we'll talk about it more in January when the countries actually join, right? But it doesn't seem to have gotten a great response so far, and I think that there's good reason for that.
At least they don't have a unanimity clause.
No, but that's mainly because if China says something, that's what's going to happen.
Right.
Right. And that's kind of lame. Before we leave the African continent, regular listeners of Working for Crusoe will recall that I frequently bust on the American media for what I consider to be the poor job that they do covering events that occur far from our shores. So in the interest of giving credit where it's due, I want to applaud NBC News, whose chief foreign affairs correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, traveled to Chad in the company of our UN ambassador, Linda Thomas Greenfield, to visit a refugee camp on the border with Darfur in Western Sudan, right? To meet with and examine the plight of refugees from the ongoing horrifying civil war in Sudan, which we covered when it erupted in April and which we've discussed a couple times since then. And so Andrea Mitchell is not just NBC's senior foreign affairs correspondent. She's one of the senior correspondents in all of American news media. I don't think this happens without her saying, I want to do this. And I should, while we're on the subject, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield also was on the PBS NewsHour last night, being interviewed by their Nick Schifrin via video link. So I want to applaud both these outlets, PBS and NBC, especially NBC, for sending someone along, for actually keeping a light shown on this subject. And especially Andrea Mitchell, who showed a clip of the trip she made through the same region with Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice in 2005. And Ambassador Thomas Greenfield said, yes, we've moved backwards in that time. Pressed by Nick Schifrin on the PBS NewsHour last night, she wasn't quite ready to say, yes, this is, again, a genocide, but that would involve, of course, certain necessary steps taken by the United States government. I expect that she will be making just such a presentation at the United Nations meeting later this fall.
And this is why you can, this is the counter argument as to where's the investment in Africa for green energy. Well, you can say, well, there's this genocide going on and there's all these coups, right? It's too unstable, right? That's the excuse.
And well, honestly, there would need to be some stabilization of some of the, it's, like I said, the Sahel has plenty of sun and wind, but it's an unstable region, right? So there is a
like
kind of
super unstable, right?
Yeah, there's kind of a chicken and egg problem here, and we should be honest about that. At the same time, this would seem to be a soluble but difficult problem.
All right, now can we talk about stock market gossip, which we so rarely do?
Sure, I guess.
This is the dumbest story ever, but of course,
there's a lot of really dumb stories out there.
All right, you know what? That's hyperbolic. So, China, again, experiencing an economic slump and in need of foreign investors, and at the same time working at cross purposes because they have an increasingly authoritarian government led by President Xi Jinping, has ordered officials at central government agencies not to bring iPhones into the office and not to use them for work, as reported by the Wall Street Journal earlier this week. China is Apple, the iPhone maker's third largest market, and accounted for 18% of total revenue last year for Apple, the most valuable company in the world. The stock price is down 6% this week. Simultaneously, Huawei, which is like the Chinese Google, kind of, has released a new phone, the Mate 60 Pro.
Surprisingly capable, they say.
Surprisingly capable. Based on what we've talked about with China and Xi being kind of tone-deafedly anti-business and being this perhaps because of his best efforts or despite his best efforts, kind of an impediment to foreign investment when China needs it a lot right now. They're banning iPhones. Like, I know that foreign investors don't work at government offices, but they might go there.
Oh, okay, but that doesn't.
I'm just like, guys, what are you doing?
Well, all right.
What are we doing, China?
I think that you're not being entirely fair here. For example,
am I plugging this into an existing narrative?
Well, yeah, man, I don't think that's entirely inappropriate for you to do that. But for instance, Apple has already said that they're trying to diversify their supply chains away from China, right? So what's China supposed to do, right? Now, retaliatory measures do seem a bit extreme, but
it's just like, why am I going to invest in China if they keep having police raids on my consultancy office, right? It's not as draconian as that, but it's certainly inconvenient.
Yeah, but it's not like Apple's going to walk away, right? And they're not going to.
But I have a theory about this.
Okay.
Apple assembles their iPhones in China, right? And it's their fastest growing market, and they accounted for 18% of Apple's total revenue. If tomorrow the entire population of China did not buy Apple products and Apple had to make their phone somewhere else and sell their phone somewhere else, it's the iPhone. There are more people on Earth who want iPhones and want jobs building them than there are in China. Now, it would be expensive, and Apple would have to make an incredible manufacturing pivot, but it's not impossible. And in fact, they could return to a pretty profitable situation if, in the snap of fingers, President Xi said no more Apple in China, consumers or manufacturing. That would obviously be a big shakeup, but it could happen.
It might take a couple years.
Sure, but
no, they'll be fine. You're absolutely right. They would be fine.
And again, this is not a podcast to talk about American exceptionalism. I'm not in that camp, but just like American hip hop or American rock and roll or American basketball, the Huawei Mate 60 Pro, Huawei, excuse me, is not going to supplant the iPhone as a cultural phenomenon.
No, but I don't.
Even in China,
China doesn't need it to. It actually could supplant the iPhone in China, and again. It's more.
You see what I'm getting at here, though, right?
I do see what you're getting at. I think that both sides of this argument are exaggerated, right? To me, this is almost a non-story, frankly, right? The Huawei phone is better than people thought it would be, but it's still, the chips in it are still not as good as the most advanced chips used in the West. They're better than analysts thought they would be, however, right? So Chinese innovative know-how is not quite so poor as people thought it might be, but it's still not up to standard with the West so far. Perhaps it will be, but because they don't have an as open a society as we do, they don't have immigrant entrepreneurs like that we have by the dozen who are very. Look at Elon Musk, Satya Nadella. We could go on, right? You can't do that in China if you're not from China, right? So they shut themselves off from the world supply of brains. In spite of that, though, their phones aren't terrible, right? They're not these, shoddy knockoffs of Western.
Right. It's not a Trabant or something.
That's right. And so now, but again, sanctions take a while to work, right? They're cumulative, right? Perhaps the idea is anyway that the next generation of chips that Western companies come up with will be just a little bit better, right, than the next generation of Chinese chips are. And in fact, that differential will grow over time, slowly, right? But where these sanctions aren't going to cripple the Chinese economy, and they're not meant to. It seems, I would say, that Chinese domestic economic policy is ultimately going to do more damage to their economy than any of these things. But that's up to them. There's nothing we can do about that.
The other thing, so I knew it was a non-story, but it was just peripherally enough about trends and things we've been talking about that I wanted to bring it up. This part is completely not important, but is breathlessly reported in the financial media. The dip in Apple's stock price, about 6%, although it's up today, Friday, about 1%, could mean that Amazon or Google's parent company Alphabet, or perhaps even Microsoft, could overtake Apple as the world's most valuable company, at least in the short term.
Okay, fine. I mean, so what?
So what? I know. I knew you would have a good reaction.
Who's leading in the AL East? I don't care, right? I mean, so then Apple will come back and beat them in a year or two. Whatever. Yeah. These are just stupid rankings that don't mean anything.
That's right.
They're all enormous companies. They're all doing fine.
They're very profitable.
And so what? Who cares who's number one or number two? It doesn't make any difference in my life at all. Right? Honestly, I think people's phones, I know people are very attached to their phones. I'm very attached to mine.
And also, let's be candid. People are very attached to Apple's stock price.
Okay, fine. But if they're just phones, right? I mean, do we really have to spend all of our time thinking about our stupid phones?
As if we don't spend enough time on it.
Exactly, right? I mean, it's just like, what are the implications on the world economy of our phones? It's just like, oh my God, right? We just had an Africa climate summit. This is actually important, right? The climate story is important. We just had the hottest summer ever, right? This year will go down in history as the year that people in Western societies finally began to feel the impact of climate change in a very real and frightening way. And I think, I have to hand it to William Ruto and other African leaders who did not say, yeah, nice of you to be here. Right. Because they've been dealing with this for decades. That genocide in Darfur 20 years ago, many people attribute that in part to climate change. That was 20 years ago.
All right. Next week, we've got a looming United Auto Workers strike deadline.
Possibly, yes. By the time we record next week, the UAW could be on strike.
And of course, that would fall in line with some other major labor actions that we've been experiencing in our Los Angeles media community with the writers and the actors.
Yes, and there's been actually quite a lot of other labor actions around the country all through the year. We'll see, though. They could avert a strike. We don't know yet. Everybody's talking tough, but that's, of course, exactly what you do when a strike deadline is looming. And of course, hopefully the strike won't prevent us from talking at length about the G20 summit, which is kicking off today, the king of them all, y'all. And I was hoping that we could use the occasion of the G20 as a springboard to talk more broadly about the growing importance of India, the host nation of the G20, in the world economy and global affairs in general, because we haven't actually done that yet. We've talked about them when they come up, but we haven't really taken a deep dive into India. So hopefully we'll have time to do that next week, but we might not if there's a strike. At the same time, if there's a strike, it'll probably last longer than a week. So we might actually push that off for another week, depending on how much we want to say about India. We'll see. Tune in next week and find out.
All right. Questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions, really anything you think of, go ahead and fire that email, johnrameymedia@gmail.com. He's Sam Park. I am John Ramey. Have yourselves a fine weekend.
Thanks, everybody.